I appreciate it. I was asked to speak about my career path, and that's an always dangerous request to make of a 70-year-old man entering his 43rd year as a professor. Will he drone on? Will he be able to finish his talk? I hope to provide some personal insights, some provocations, and be mercifully brief. I do look forward to our chance to have questions and discussion. In preparing for today, I began to see my career as one of being on the shoulders of my teachers, disciplines, and responsibilities. It is perhaps a useful metaphor. I grew up in the Pacific Northwest on the shoulders of Mount Rainier, the tallest mountain in the lower 48, a dormant, for now, volcano, and one of America's first national parks. I was privileged, if not by religion. 1950s America was often anti-Semitic, by race, gender, and economic class. Think of it. As a child, I never once saw a fully bare kitchen cupboard or went to bed hungry for lack of food. Full food security is perhaps one of the greatest privileges a person can claim. The first set of shoulders I relied on were my teachers, and that begins with my mom, who was active in the civil rights movement in the 60s through the Dolls for Democracy program. She would travel to schools with large handmade dolls and tell the story of Mahatma Gandhi, Florence Nightingale, George Washington Carver. The best part is I got to, as a little boy, sit at her feet and listen to the talk. And afterwards, when the dolls came home, few American boys in the 1950s got to play with a Mahatma Gandhi doll or a Florence Nightingale doll. And then there was the shoulders of my high school teacher, James Wichterman, whose teaching was rigorous, questioning was probing, and his editing ruthless. I try to emulate his Socratic method of teaching even now. In graduate school, I learned from Don Field, one of the first social scientists hired by the National Park Service. He taught me the importance of creating usable knowledge and how to work respectfully with science and resource managers, striving to meet their needs through research. In my doctoral studies, I leaned on the shoulders of William Birch. He demanded his students read widely, read across disciplines, and study difficult problems. I was a difficult and defiant graduate student and was expelled from one class as a Ph.D. student for bad behavior. But that's a different story. When I began to work as a professor at the University of Idaho within the Park Service, Michael Sukup became a guide and my teacher. I was then chief social scientist in an agency that did not fully value social science. Sukup introduced me to the long game, the strategy of being both principled and political at the same time. And regardless of what you hear from the rants on social media or the news, it is possible to be principled and political at the same time. And then, interestingly enough, my mentors, the shoulders I leaned on, swerved toward a set of extraordinary women leaders in science. Shirley Malcolm at the American Association for the Advancement of Science reminded me of my responsibility to work for social justice and inclusion. Marcia McNutt, who is now president of the National Academy of Sciences, was an extraordinary role model and a teacher on the ways of Washington, D.C. Rita Caldwell, a brilliant scientist and former director of the National Science Foundation, gave credence to my science policy ideas, and sometimes, and to my exasperation, she found almost all the time in every sentence that I ever wrote with her something that needed to be improved, edited, cut out, or changed. Not a single sentence did I write that satisfied her demands. These shoulders were robust forms of privilege. I think more men should be mentored by powerful women leaders. It would do us all good. I also look back and forward, and I see that my career was on the shoulders of disciplines, that is, interdisciplinary on the edges of the settled mainstream fields of study. At first, it was combining forestry and outdoor recreation. And then forestry broadened to trying to understand ecology, and outdoor recreation broadened to understand conservation management. And now I've begun work with artist Todd Anderson to explore how art and science can be made truly collaborative. It's a work in progress. Soon, Todd and I will announce a graduate student workshop in December of 2022 on art and science combined, a field workshop in Puerto Rico where art students will learn scientific techniques, science students will learn photography and drawing, and both will learn the skills of collaboration. I also had to learn the shoulders of responsibility. I was mentored and taught that with privilege comes responsibility, and I tried to shoulder that responsibility as best I could. I once ran a summer camp sponsored by the Kiwanis Clubs of Seattle on Whidbey Island, Washington. It was targeted to severely disabled children who were cruelly housed in institutional settings common to the 1960s. As a 20-year-old camp director, that's right, as a 20-year-old camp director, I am confident I broke every rule established by the American Camping Association. The children humbled myself and all the other camp staff with their resilience and courage. We loved every rambunctious moment of it. And then the shoulders of responsibility matured, as they do, and I moved on. I worked on the shoulder of academic life and conservation management, and then on the shoulders of conservation and politics. Bridging was difficult. Progress was slow. And there were lost struggles and failures and hard-won successes. The failures sweetened the value of the successes. Currently, I'm working on sustainability issues on the shoulders of several disciplines, but for the forgotten, sustainability for the poorest of the poor, the chronic underclass, victims of natural disasters, refugees, the politically oppressed, the imprisoned, and the slaved. It's a book, an evidence-based rant, and one that seeks redemption for a sustainability movement and sustainability education that I think has gone deeply astray. We shall see if it's successful. So what are the lessons learned and how might they have utility for you? I'm trying to answer Ryan's first and second questions. Here are a few. First, teachers are not temporary. They are cumulative. Field and Birch and Rita Caldwell are still my teachers, Second, except for night driving, traveling on the shoulders is a good strategy. Treat each of the disciplines you learn from with clear-eyed respect. Third, almost everything lasting that I learned came from a book, not a journal article. Know your intellectual genealogy. Know where your disciplines, your area of interest came from. With privilege comes responsibility, constant, pressing, and open to opportunity. The responsibility opens us for the opportunity to make a difference, to answer the question, so what? And use privilege for good. A career on the shoulders is exhilarating, and I would highly recommend it. But then I know no other way. Thanks.
All right, y'all. I'm going to get us started. You can ask questions in the chat, or you can ask questions out loud.
And I'm going to, Ryan, with your permission, just sit down.
Gary, you can sit down.
Thanks.
Thank you for asking. What experiment or study did you think you had the right idea with that you just simply got wrong?
That's a good question. For about 5 years at the University of Idaho, I thought I had figured out the new West. That is a new progressive West that was going to be very different from the traditional one, tourist-based, progressive in its policies, environmentally aware. And I thought I had figured out that that was coming. And I started writing on it, and then I realized slowly that I was wrong. I was just plain wrong, that there were other forces that I hadn't thought about. And that vision was more what I wanted the world to be than what the world was going to be. And I had to finally give that up. So I have about 200 pages of writing that will never see the light of day because it wasn't accurate. I didn't all of a sudden have a flash. I was wrong. I had to come about it over a period of months to realize I was going down the wrong direction, that I had misunderstood the political situation in the American West. That would be one example.
All right, y'all. Now it's the hard part. Someone's going to jump in and ask a question to Gary Machlis.
I said, okay, I'll play.
All right.
Gary, thank you for the presentation. Wonderful as always. My question is, as you look back on this career that you're still involved in, what are some big questions that you almost went after that you did not pursue eventually?
That's a fair question. When I was appointed science advisor to the director in the Obama administration, right before that appointment, I had submitted to NSF a proposal to study bioluminescent bays and the impact of human ecosystems on the health of those bioluminescent bays on Vieques, Puerto Rico, a place that I dearly love. And it was a very detailed scientific proposal that had a decent chance. It wasn't guaranteed that it would be funded, but had a decent chance with a team. Once the appointment was offered, once I was nominated, I had to give that up. And I worried about that for about 15 seconds and then realized the responsibility and opportunity to work in the Obama administration for me personally was important. So I gave it up, and it still sits, and I've never gone back to it. But I had to make that choice. I had to make that choice that I wasn't going to do my own research at the same time I was science advisor to the director, for the very real political reason, Matt, that if I had my own research program, then all my decisions in advising the director could be suspect for a conflict of interest. And I needed to stop that. That's an example of one sitting in a corner somewhere.
Gary, Tanya had a question. What's your advice to starting out as an academic writer?
That's a good question. I would say write and keep writing. Write every day. Commas are your enemy. Write clear and concise, and use an outline. Don't just start writing, but have a logical outline. And then realize that journals and books and presentations all will reward good writers. If you're writing a journal article and it's well written, clear, concise, with a good rhythm to the words, that's going to count. That's going to matter. And then the last would be always read what you've written out loud to yourself. If it sounds weird, rewrite it. Those would be some examples.
My Zoom froze, Gary. So if you could click the chat button for me, I think you can hear me, but I am frozen.
Okay.
What a perfect time for that to happen. Just click chat, and if it shows up there. Yeah. So Katie Thurston asked, how do you pick your battles as a graduate student?
As a graduate student,
Mm-hmm.
Katie, I'm the wrong one to ask because, like I said, I was a difficult grad student. I picked all kinds of battles. There once was a professor who started being disrespectful and yelling at some undergraduate that was in the class, and I stood up and said, "Whoa, buddy, come at me, let's go." You know, and so I'm probably the wrong one, but I would say I pick the battles that have substance beyond yourself. That is a battle of, if it's just a battle, you want this and your professor wants that, that's less important than there's a right and a wrong thing going on and you're protecting the right thing going on. So I would pick strategic battles not based on personal ego as much as does it matter to someone other than yourself. An example could be if a professor was pushing you as a grad student to do a research methodology that you didn't think was right. That's not a bad battle to fight, since the research is going to have consequences down the road. It might get used by managers. It might go to court. It might be published in a journal. That's a fair battle. A battle over, I wrote this sentence and I really like it and you're taking it out, that's not worth doing. That's just about yourself.
So Gary, I got a question. What do you think the future of science looks like in this politically charged atmosphere?
I think the future of science itself is too broad. It's like a multi-lane highway. Some sciences are going to have a fast track future of high growth and strong support. An example would be clinical medicine or aerospace science, a lot of them that have economic value. Others are going to be much more slower and contentious, like those that look at inequality and social policies that are harmful. And so it's a multi-lane highway, and not all sciences are going to go down the track at the same speed.
All right. Gary, I can't see the chat right now. I just got an email, actually, is how I got that question.
Okay, so I will read them. Sarah Lack Esters asks, is there a way you recommend for a young professional to deal with the inherent cognitive dissonance that comes from working in an environment that doesn't always align with your values? Sarah's question, which is excellent, essentially describes much of the last 4 years for many individuals. There is no reason that we are all privileged to work for or with colleagues or institutions that perfectly align with our values. If you want to do that, perfectly align, then I recommend self-employment. But if you want to work in an institution, the question becomes, which of your values are so core to your being and your sense of moral purpose that violating them is disrespectful to yourself? Those values, you're going to have to make some important hard decisions. But not every value dissonance is a fight. Not every one is a struggle. And not every one is a sword to fall on. The next question, what are your top recommended books or other ways to inspire creativity in your research and writing? That's a great question. Excuse me while I get them. Okay. And everyone saw that my writing chair has a big hole in the back of it. It's an important question because several places in my career, a book has told me where to go. It's been the compass that said, I read that book and boom, things happened. And I knew what I wanted to do. I was teaching in an outdoor recreation program in 1975 when Wilson's sociobiology book came out. I read it cover to cover, and all of a sudden I decided I needed to go back to school. I needed to go back to school, but where should I go? And then I read a book by Bill Birch called Daydreams and Nightmares, a sociological essay on the American environment. And I said, I want to go study with Birch. He was at Yale. And I said, darn, if he had been at Santa Cruz, I could have learned to surf at the same time. This is going to cost too much. So I applied, was rejected. I didn't get admitted. And I wrote him a letter, said, no, you made a mistake. No one had ever really done that to the admissions office before. And they said, okay, you can come. But it's the book that led me to Birch. Only recently, and then this book, this is Self-Promotion, a book I wrote with Birch, The Human Ecosystem. But this is important. How many of us write a book with their major professor 40 years later, after they were your professor 40 years ago? That's an extraordinary privilege. And the last one is a 98-cent book I picked up called Freedom to Starve, a little paperback, by a French priest under the pseudonym of Paul Galette. When I finished this book, this 98-cent little paperback, I threw away about 4 research projects that I was going to do and focused on the thing that I'm doing the most now, the sustainability for the poor, for the forgotten. This book was like a lightning bolt to the head. My point is, there is no one book that I can recommend to you that is the spark that will guide you. I do recommend books will be the spark. Find a book that changes you, that really speaks to you in a powerful way that you can't get it out of your mind, and follow that book. The next question what would be your advice for young researchers like me who come with different social value and philosophy from the global South, in Pramod's case, India, to global North, the USA, to pursue social science research? That's a fair question, because so much of social science research can be deconstructed as based on either core values or economic systems that individuals take for granted. But I believe students from other countries can come here and do two things: absorb as best they can the methodologies that are relevant at home. Not all are, but some are. And second, learn American social science with a critical eye. There's nothing wrong with learning it and saying, what's wrong with this? What's limiting? Where is it not relevant to my home situation? So learning it with a critical eye sends you home well armed. Would that more American grad students go to India to learn about sustainable development and social science research in India from Indian professors, and then come back armed with that. Then here's a question: how do you remain hopeful during a politically and environmental uncertain future? Lydia, that's a fair question. I almost gave an answer that said, who says I'm hopeful? But I am. Let me give, and how do you do it? Is you find the individuals or stories that inspire you. Anybody here that's suffering from a lack of hope about environmental future should read Jane Goodall's new book, Hope. If anyone has the right to write about the future from a point of view of wisdom, it would be Jane Goodall. Read her book, Hope. The second argument is when I see a grad student doing an amazing project, I immediately get hopeful. At Wayne State University in Detroit, not some Ivy League school, Wayne State in Detroit, they have a home ec program. And home economic programs are the most disrespected programs in university. Everybody talks down to them, thinks they're lower than themselves. But the home ec professor assigned a task to the fashion students of developing from surplus materials a piece of clothing for the homeless. And a young graduate student used surplus auto insulation to develop a coat, a winter coat for the homeless of Detroit that also could unzip and be reformatted as a sleeping bag, that could be reformatted as a storage bag. And she invented it as part of her class, and then formed a company that hired the homeless to make these coats. And you and I can't go buy one. I can pay the $140 to give a coat to a homeless person, but this isn't a kind of poverty tourism. That was a grad student in home economics and fashion. And I can tell you that made me more hopeful than 18 grad students doing biodiversity research in a national park. Then, have you ever experienced burnout or creative drought in your career? If so, what steps did you take to renew and return to your work? Fair. I think the most recent burnout was yesterday morning. Writing block. I'm trying to finish this book on sustainability for the forgotten. It's called Desolation Row, taken from Bob Dylan's song. And I'm supposed to write 4 pages a day. I write by hand, 4 pages a day. If I don't do that, I feel like I have burned out. And if I go a whole week without it because I'm doing other things, I start to really feel that burnout. How do I get back to it? It sounds bizarre, but I get up in the morning and I say, okay, if I can't write 4 pages, write 1 page. Just write one page. And if I can get that one page done, then I can move forward. Then I can move forward. So you experience burnout all the time. It's the old Buddhist saying of knock down 6 times, get up 7. And so the question is, burnout's not a problem unless you can't get out of it. And you got to find your own way. For some, it's go jog. For some, it's bake a pie. For some, it's read a novel, read poetry, or do a painting. And for others, it's sit down and force yourself to write one page and call it a victory. Then, what are some skills or qualities to look for in a positive writing research collaborator? That's a great question. What are the skills and qualities you would see as a red flag? I was very fortunate that when I was fired as the science advisor to the director on the inauguration of President Trump, because I was in the Obama administration, we were all fired that morning. That's the way it's supposed to work. No surprise, no worries, no regrets. That's the way it's supposed to work. But once I was fired, the next day, the director of the Park Service and I began to write a book about the dangers of what was coming and how the conservation movement could respond. And we wrote as collaborators. I had worked for him for 8 years, and now I was the senior author and knew how to write books, and he didn't. So we reversed roles. But here's the best quality John had and has as a collaborator that you should look for. An interest in having the research or the text be as good as possible, as opposed to having their contribution defended. We would each write a section, and then we would each revise the other person's section. And the reason it worked is when John was revising my section and then getting it back to me, the question was not, oh, did he not like what I wrote? It's, is it better? Did he improve it? And so the skill is have a shared goal of the best you can do together. And the red flag is people who want to defend their way of doing stuff. I think that's all the questions that are on the chat.
Gary, can you hear me?
Oh, wait, no, here's a question from Keith Russell. Hi, Keith. What is one regret you have in your career? One thing that you may have done differently? Just one? There were many. I ran a program. The biggest regret, Keith, I would say, is that while I was chief social scientist for 8 years, and then, 6 years, and then science advisor, I didn't take graduate students because I didn't feel it was fair to graduate students to not be able to give them the time they needed. And if my graduate students got funding or opportunities in the Park Service, it would look like perceived conflict of interest. I feel bad. I've lost out not being able to have grad students. Now I can, and I'm looking forward to that. But that's one major regret, that I had to choose between doing it principled and not having favored grad students, or being able to go and do the work straight.
Here, question for you, and maybe you don't know a great answer to it, but the replication crisis in psych and now shifting over to social science. What are your thoughts on that facing us in PRT and conservation science? So studies not replicating when they're done independently.
Right. Replication is very complicated because so many exogenous outside variables can contaminate the process, the data. There's a whole range. I'm less worried or concerned about replication than I am encouraging for contradiction. if there's a piece of research and it isn't quite replicated, there's a whole bunch of answers. But if there's a piece of research and it is tested using the steps of strong inference, and it's clearly shown that there's a completely different outcome in terms of the hypothesis, that's an important thing to do. No one should fall in love with their hypotheses. We should all treat them as temporary and provisionary. But replication in and of itself is okay, it's useful, but more important is the person who would contradict, in a revolutionary sense way, contradict the status quo.
So to push back on that a little bit, just because I'm contradictory, you mentioned E.O. Wilson, and one of the things that E.O. Wilson has been struck by is he's found that sociobiology may not replicate as well as he thought, and now he's not able to publish in the Journal of Sociobiology saying that thing. Where have you maybe experienced the thing that you were right about in the 70s that you're wrong about now, or 80s or 90s?
That's a good question. I can tell you one thing that I was taught that I very quickly realized was false. And so as a grad student just coming out, I had been given this trained incapacity to think, and then I had to think on my own. And that was, I went through an outdoor recreation and parks graduate program that began with the assumption that parks are good, with a big G, that parks are good things, and that everybody thinks parks are good. There was an understanding that ranchers and others with other interests, but parks were good. And it was only after I left that and had international experiences that I began to realize that that assumption that parks are good with a big G may not always be true. And I had to recalibrate that. I remember precisely a moment when grad students said, I want to study crime in parks, crime in urban parks. And I want to study, like, go to parks in underrepresented neighborhoods and look for drug use and needle exchange and all this stuff. And I said, well, I thought you wanted to study real crime. Oh, I do. And I said, well, then go to the golf courses, because that's where the real white collar crime is going on. The big crimes are going on in the golf courses and the yacht clubs. Go study there. And I never saw the student again, you know. And so that was an evolution of values that I had been trained that I think were in error. Parks may be good, they may be bad. Kampuchea and Vietnam went to war over the establishment of a park. But that's a question to be analyzed for each case. That would be one.
We'll wait just another minute or so to see if there are any other questions. But Gary, every time I talk to you, I find out something that I'm kind of wrong about, and I appreciate that about you. And I'm sure you've had the same echo. And so I'm happy to stand on your shoulders as much as I can, as long as we're not in a pool and you're stuck underwater. And so thank you for making time.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure. And so for those of you that have the pleasure of being at Clemson, we're going to head to the Pendleton Brewery. And those of you who are within 20 minutes driving distance, we'll see you there. Marika, do you have any parting thoughts or shots for Gary?
No shots, but thank you very much, Gary, for sharing your experiences with us and for being so open to this conversation and for presenting your ideas. You know, I really respect that you are constantly evolving, and you've had a very nice long career, but still choosing new approaches and new ways to challenge yourself and to challenge what you know about the world. And I just really appreciate that.
One final comment. Clemson is an extraordinary place. It is, I am deeply grateful for the opportunity to work here. Most people, when they shift in their career at late age, they have job shock. where it isn't quite what they thought it would be. Mine is that it's been a wonderful experience, even better than I thought it would be. And I can't say enough about the quality of and extraordinary skill sets of our graduate students. So I am grateful to be at Clemson, and we're all pretty privileged.
Yeah, we're glad you're here. And thank you everybody for joining us today.
Yes. We'll post a recording of this for those of you who can't join, and then I'll make sure that we post Deb's talk and Gary's talk on the PRT Science YouTube channel, which will now have 2 videos in it. And we'll keep this going. I appreciate y'all and see you later.
Thank you.